Okay, welcome to part 8 of this series. In this video we're going to be creating the function to actually create the conversation and add all the various users to it and all that sort of thing. So just to recap very briefly what we've gone over in the last part, what we have at the moment is a form down here which submits to the current page, and then just slightly further up we check to see if the form has been submitted with PHP obviously, and then we do some sort of validation on the data that they submit. As part of that, we're getting a list of usernames here, and that's a function that we created in the previous part. And then just where this little comment is here, what we're going to do is create. We're going to call a function here, and we're going to create it in our backend file, obviously. So this function is going to be called create conversation. So I'm just going to write this out here now. Obviously, at the moment it won't work because we haven't defined it yet, but it's called create conversation, and it's going to take 3 parameters. The first one being the array of user IDs, so we're just going to pass in user IDs here. The second one is going to be the subject of the conversation without a V in it, and the final one is just going to be the text to act as sort of the first message. So I'm just going to set this to body. No, I'm not. I'm going to set this. Okay, sorry. I'm going to set these two to the post variables. So this should be post subject. Oops. And this should be post text, I think. Yeah, no, sorry, post body. Okay, so post body. Like so. Okay? And there is one more thing we're going to do, which is we're going to call array unique here on this array. Because it's possible that the user may enter the same username more than once in the list of usernames, which would add that user to the list twice, which is obviously not what they want. They don't want to be given the same conversation twice, because that would just be quite confusing. It'll cause all kinds of bugs. So just to make sure that that never happens, we're just going to call array unique. And all this does is make sure that there is only one element of the same type in the array. So say if this array was had numbers 1, 2, 2, 3, 4, it just return the result 1, 2, 3, 4. So it removes all except one of things that there are more than one of. So there you go. Okay, so now that we've tried to call this function, what we need to do is go to our backend file up here and actually define it. So I'm going to go to this file. I'm going to create a new function called create conversation. It's going to take 3 parameters. The first one being a list of user IDs, the second one being the subject, and the final one being the body. Obviously we need to escape the data and make sure it's safe to use inside of an SQL query. So we're going to take the subject and set that equal to the MySQL real escape string of the subject. Oops. Like so. And then we're going to do the same for the body. So body equals MySQL real escape string with a lowercase s, not that it really matters. Body, 1 bracket, that does matter. And we also need to make sure that we protect ourselves against XSS attacks. So we need to make sure that the user can't either accidentally or in some sort of deliberate hack attempt enter HTML code in here. So the way we do that is just by calling HTML entities, which I always spell wrong. So let's see about that. Okay, there we go. So now we've done that, we are going to first insert a row into the conversations table, which is just going to store the fact that this conversation exists. So this is just going to be where the subject is defined. So we're now going to run a new query here. So we're going to run a MySQL query, and the SQL is going to be fairly short, so I'm just going to do this inline. I'm not going to create an SQL variable. And we're going to insert into the conversations table, and the columns we're going to be inserting are the conversation subject, and the values we're going to be specifying are just going to be the subject. So that is the value of this subject variable, and that's it for that line. So because we need to insert the ID that this returns into our other columns, so if you remember, if you look at the database just quickly, you can see that the conversations table is here, and that's going to have a unique ID. but then this members table and the messages table both need to use the conversation ID as well, because they need to store, which conversation the user is a member of and which conversation the message belongs to. So we also need to store, we need to get the ID from that insert so we can then use it in our other inserts, if that makes any sense. So the way we can get the ID is by using the MySQL insert ID function, and all that does is return the last automatically generated ID of the last insert query that the server has performed, which is obviously going to be this one above because we've just done that. So we're going to create a new variable called conversation ID here, and this is going to be equal to the MySQL insert ID function. Need a T, obviously. Okay, there we go. So then we can use this to insert the data into our messages table and our members table. We're going to do the messages table first because it's the simplest, and this is a little bit longer, so I'm going to create an SQL variable to hold the SQL so we can use line breaks and it'll look nice. That's the only reason that we create a variable, by the way. So the SQL is going to be insert into the table name, which is going to be conversations messages. The columns are going to be the conversation ID, which we've just got from the previous insert, the user ID, which we know from the session, the message date, which we know because it's the current date, and the message text, which we know because it's what the user typed. Then we're going to come down a line and specify the values for this insert, and these values are going to be the conversation ID, session ID, the session ID, the user's ID, which we have in the session from when they logged in, so we can just use session user ID, and then we can use the MySQL function Unix timestamp, which just gets the current time. We could also use PHP's time function here, but I'm just going to be using the MySQL equivalent because I don't know, I just prefer it really. And the final thing is the message body, which we just have in this body variable. Okay, so that's that SQL complete. Next thing we need to do is obviously run it. So we're going to use MySQL query SQL. Okay, so that's that done. Now the next part is we need to insert the list of users into the conversation members table. And there is a slight problem here in the way that we actually need to format our query, because we need to insert sort of one of these parts, i.e. something after the values keyword, to indicate a row, basically. So we need one of these for each user. But we don't know how many users there are. Well, we do, but we're going to loop over them and all that sort of stuff. So what we need to do, well, I'll just write out the basic SQL first. So the SQL that we're going to be running is going to be stored in an SQL variable again. I'm going to use the same command as before, so insert into conversations members, and the columns we're going to be inserting are the conversation ID, the user ID, the last time the conversation was viewed by this user, which is going to be set to conversation. Well, it's not going to be set to. This was the name of the column that we used. Conversation last view, and also a flag, which is just a 1 or 0 value, which just indicates if they have deleted the conversation. So conversation deleted is going to be that column name. Okay, so then we need our values. So what we want here is the conversation ID. So conversation ID, and then we want the user ID, which is going to come from the user IDs array. So just for now, I'm just going to set this to that, which doesn't really mean anything, but it's just what I'm using as sort of a placeholder for now, because we don't have this value yet. The next thing, conversation last view, is going to be 0, because that's infinite. Well, it's not infinite. That's like a time in the past where so all new messages will still look red. You can actually just leave this field out and just have no value specified, and MySQL will default to 0. However, I just felt it was a bit more proper to specify a value for it. and then we're going to do the same for deleted, because we don't want them to have the message deleted. So what we need to do is duplicate this portion for every user ID. And it needs to be a comma separated list, like so, except with one comma, obviously. So the way we're going to do this is by taking these and storing them into an array, and then we're going to implode the list of sort of these strings and make that part of our SQL variable. So I'm just going to cut that now and delete all of these, and we'll come back to this line in a moment. So just above, what we're going to do is define a new array called values, which is just going to be the values, and it's going to be equal to a new array, and then we're going to loop over, using a for each loop, over the user IDs, so as user ID. Okay, so inside this loop we're going to add into the values array one of the values, or one of the portions of the SQL query. So that's one of those. So we're just going to do values equals that, except we're going to use quotes. Okay, like that. And this is where we're going to replace our ID placeholder with our actual user ID. Fairly straightforward. So now down here, what we can do is add on the result of implode using a comma and a space just to make it look a bit neater. The values array. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So this is just this array from up here, which we've added into a sort of portion of an SQL query. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Now there is one more problem with this, in that at the moment all we're doing is inserting all the sort of recipients of the message. We need to actually also insert the the actual the user sending the message, because they might want to read it themselves, or if someone replies, they obviously need to be able to see the reply. So there are two ways we could do this. One way is just to, before we do this loop, add the current user's ID onto the end of this array, or we could also duplicate this up here, so manually inserting it for the user ID that's the current session, the current user ID. We could insert it manually into the array before we do the loop. To be honest, I think I prefer the second method, which is to insert the user's ID into this array. It just seems a bit neater, because say you wanted to change the formatting, if you had this manually inserted above the loop, you'd have to change this in two places. Like say if you want to swap around these two columns, well actually that's a bad example. Say you want to swap around these two columns, you'd have to swap two things around here and somewhere above. So for the sake of ease of maintaining the code in the future, we're going to use the method that I just mentioned. So what we're going to do is just append to the user IDs array the current logged in user, like so. Okay, and there is one more thing we need to do, which is to make sure that this data is properly sanitized. At the moment we've got it set up so that all of these IDs come directly from the database, which means that there's no real need to do this. However, if you've got some other system where you're using the same function, you've just copy and pasted the function code, that may not take IDs directly from the database. So just for the sake of preserving the security of future projects, we're just going to set user ID equal to the int user ID. Okay, so that should just make absolutely sure that we're not going to get anything bad happening. So obviously all we need to do now is run our query, so MySQL query of SQL, not Y, and that's this function pretty much complete. So what we can do for the final part of this video, well actually one thing before we do that is we need to add a comment to indicate what this does. So this function creates a new conversation making the given users a member. Not really sure about that. Anyway, never mind. It doesn't really matter about the comment as long as you know what it means. Anyway, last thing we need to do is test to see if this works. So we're just going to go back to our page and make sure that we remember to call it properly. So back on our page, looks about right. So what I'm going to do is go back to our browser, and we're going to go to the new conversation page and start a new conversation Oh, first we're going to need to actually have another user we can send a message to. So I'm going to go to the users table and insert a new row, and we're going to call this guy Bob, and his password is going to be loop. Why not? Oh, and that also needs to be an SHA1 as before. Okay, so just click on go, I guess, yep, and then just click browse, and there you can see Bob is now in the table. So we should be able to send a message to Bob, the subject being testing, and the message can just be a question mark. So we'll just click send. Fatal error. Oh dear. Maybe I don't think I've. What have I done? Oh, actually, I think what I've done is not included this library file. So let's just check out the init file, and yeah, there we go. So we obviously need to include the private message backend file. So I'm just going to duplicate this line here below, and change user to private message, and then we can try that again. Okay, there we go. So we get the message has been sent, but the crucial thing here is, has it inserted to the table properly? So let's look at our conversations table. That has one row, which is encouraging. Now let's look at the messages table. That appears to have the message. It was sent by me. I had ID 1. The text is right, and all this other stuff looks right. And the members also looks right, which is good. So you can see the user ID. So 1 is me, 2 is Bob, and 1 for both for the conversation ID. So that's pretty much covered creating a conversation. In the next part, I'm going to show you how to list these messages in a nice sort of formatted way. Just a list of subjects and last post time and all that. And we'll start creating the inbox page. Okay, so thanks for watching, and come back for parts 9, I think it will be.